Welcome to Questions for Jesus. Rachel and Adam will be your guides for deeper insight and thoughtful discussions.
Ever feel like you're pouring your heart out in prayer, but just met with silence? Like shouting into a void. I think we've all been there at some point. That feeling of frustration, even abandonment, when it seems like God just isn't listening. But what if we've misunderstood the silence?
It is fascinating how our human brains are wired for instant gratification. You know, we crave immediate responses, especially when we're in distress. But silence, particularly in a spiritual context, can be incredibly challenging for us to process.
It really can. I remember a time I was going through the tough period, praying constantly, begging for some kind of relief. Some sign I wasn't alone, but it felt like my prayers were hitting a brick wall. I started to doubt, to wonder if I was doing something wrong, if maybe God was disappointed in me.
That feeling of self-blame is a common response when we encounter what we perceive as divine silence. We internalize that lack of response as a personal failing, a sign that we're somehow unworthy.
It's so easy to fall into that trap, isn't it?
It is.
But the more I wrestled with those feelings, the more I started to realize maybe I was looking at it all wrong. Maybe God's silence wasn't a punishment, but an invitation.
An invitation to what?
An invitation to dig deeper, to cultivate patience, to learn to trust in a timeline that isn't dictated by my immediate desires. It's like planting a seed.
Right.
You know, we don't see the roots growing beneath the surface, but that doesn't mean the process isn't happening.
That's a beautiful analogy. And it speaks to the importance of embracing the unseen, the unfolding of a plan that's beyond our immediate comprehension.
Exactly. And I think that's where the real growth happens. In that space between the asking and the receiving, where we learn to surrender to a power greater than ourselves. So instead of praying for specific outcomes, I started praying for wisdom, for patience, for the strength to trust in God's timing, even when it felt impossible.
That shift in focus from demanding to surrendering is incredibly powerful. It allows us to move from a transactional view of prayer to a relational one, where the focus is on connection rather than outcome.
And you know what? As I started to approach prayer with that mindset, something amazing happened. The silence didn't feel like a void anymore. It felt more like a sacred space, a place where I could connect with God on a deeper level. It wasn't about getting a quick fix. It was about cultivating a relationship built on trust and surrender.
And that, I believe, is the essence of true faith. The ability to find peace and solace, even in the absence of immediate answers. To trust that even in silence, God is working for our good.
It's that trust that allows us to weather the storms of life, isn't it? It's the anchor that keeps us steady when everything else feels uncertain.
Precisely. And that sense of stability, that inner knowing that we're not alone, is crucial for our emotional and spiritual well-being. It allows us to face challenges with courage and to find meaning, even in the midst of suffering.
But what about those times when we're convinced that God's silence is actually a no? Like when we're praying for something, we desperately want something that feels good and right. But the door keeps slamming shut. Is God trying to tell us something?
That's a question that has plagued theologians and philosophers for centuries. But I think it's important to remember that God's no is not necessarily a rejection. It might be a redirection, a way of steering us towards a path that's ultimately more aligned with our soul's purpose.
So it's like that saying, when one door closes, another one opens. Sometimes we're so focused on the closed door that we miss the open one right in front of us.
Exactly. We get fixated on a specific outcome, on our own limited understanding of what's best, and we fail to see the possibilities that are unfolding around us.
I remember a time when I was absolutely convinced that a certain career path was God's plan for me. I prayed fervently, I worked tirelessly, I did everything I thought I was supposed to do, but one opportunity after another fell through and I felt utterly defeated. I couldn't understand why God would keep closing those doors.
I can imagine how frustrating that must have been.
It's
like running into a brick wall over and over again, wondering why you can't seem to break through.
It was. But looking back, I can see how those closed doors were actually blessings in disguise. They forced me to reassess my priorities, to explore different paths, to open myself up to possibilities I hadn't even considered before.
It's often in those moments of perceived failure or rejection that we're forced to confront our deepest fears, to question our assumptions, and to ultimately discover a strength and resilience we didn't know we possessed.
It's like we're being pushed out of our comfort zones, forced to grow and evolve in ways we wouldn't have chosen for ourselves. And sometimes that's exactly what we need to discover our true potential.
And our true purpose. It's often when we surrender our limited vision to a higher power that we're able to tap into a wisdom that's far greater than our own.
It's like you're being guided through a labyrinth.
Right.
And even though we can't see the entire path, we can trust that there's a way out and that we're not alone in the journey.
That's a beautiful way to put it. It's about surrendering to the mystery, to the unfolding of a plan that's beyond our immediate comprehension.
But how do we reconcile that with our human need for control? We crave certainty. We want to know what's coming next. And the silence, the not knowing, can be incredibly unsettling.
That's where faith comes in. It's the willingness to trust in the unseen, to surrender to a power greater than ourselves, even when it feels counterintuitive.
It's about letting go of the reins, isn't it? About trusting that even when we can't see the path, God is leading us in the right direction.
Precisely. And that surrender, that leap of faith, is often the catalyst for profound transformation.
But what about those times when it feels like we're doing everything right? We're praying, we're seeking guidance, we're trying to live in accordance with God's will, but we still feel forgotten.
Right.
Like we're shouting into the void and no one's listening.
That feeling of being forgotten, of being abandoned by the very source of our being, can be incredibly painful.
It really can.
Yeah.
I remember a time when...
Hold that thought. We'll dive deeper into that feeling of abandonment after a quick break.
You were about to share a time when you felt forgotten by God, even when you thought you were doing everything right.
Right. It was during a period when I was facing a lot of uncertainty and upheaval in my life. I was praying for guidance, for clarity, for some kind of reassurance that I was on the right path. But the silence felt deafening. It was like God had turned his back on me.
That sense of abandonment can be particularly acute when we're already feeling vulnerable or overwhelmed. It's like a double blow. We're struggling to cope with external challenges.
And then we feel like our spiritual support system has vanished as well.
It's almost like a primal fear, isn't it?
Yeah.
Like being a child lost in a crowd, desperately searching for a familiar face.
Exactly. That need for connection, for reassurance that we're loved and protected, is deeply ingrained in our psyche. When that connection feels severed, it can trigger a cascade of anxiety and despair.
And in those moments, it's so easy to question everything. Our faith, our worthiness, even God's goodness.
It's a natural response to pain and uncertainty, but it's also an opportunity to examine those beliefs, to dig deeper into the roots of our faith.
But how do we do that when we're feeling so lost and alone? When the silence feels like a confirmation of our worst fears?
It's not easy, that's for sure. It requires a certain level of courage, a willingness to confront those fears and doubts head on, and sometimes it means seeking support from others who understand what we're going through.
It's like we need a lifeline, someone to throw us a rope when we're drowning in a sea of doubt.
Exactly. And that lifeline can come in many forms. A trusted friend, a spiritual mentor, the therapist, even a community of believers who can offer support and encouragement.
But what if we don't have that kind of support system? What if we feel like we're completely alone in this struggle?
Even then, we're not truly alone. There's a rich history of spiritual seekers who have wrestled with these same questions, who have cried out in anguish and found solace in the divine. Their stories can offer us guidance, comfort, and a reminder that we're part of a lineage of faith that extends far beyond our individual experiences.
I love that. It's like we're surrounded by a cloud of witnesses cheering us on, reminding us that we're not the first to walk this path and we won't be the last.
And those stories can offer us a new perspective on silence. We can see how others have navigated those periods of darkness and emerged with a deeper understanding of God's love and faithfulness.
So instead of seeing silence as a void, we can see it as a pregnant pause, a time of gestation, a period of preparation for something new to emerge.
Precisely. It's like the fallow period in agriculture, when the land is left to rest and regenerate before the next planting season. That period of seeming inactivity is actually essential for future growth and abundance.
I love that analogy. It's a reminder that sometimes the most productive thing we can do is to simply be still, to listen, to trust that even in the silence, God is working for our good.
And to allow ourselves to be transformed by that silence, to let shape us, refine us, and prepare us for the next chapter of our journey.
But what about those times when the silence feels less like a fallow period and more like a test of faith? Like God is withholding something from us to see if we'll keep believing. I know that's a perspective that some people hold, and it can be incredibly difficult to grapple with.
It's certainly a perspective that has been debated for centuries, but I think it's important to remember that God's love is not conditional. It's not a reward for good behavior or a punishment for our shortcomings. It's a constant, unwavering force that surrounds us whether we feel it or not.
So even when we feel like we're being tested, even when we're wrestling with doubt and despair, God's love is still there.
Absolutely. It's like the sun shining behind the clouds. We may not see it, but it's still there, providing warmth and light.
But how do we reconcile that with the pain and suffering that we see in the world? How can we believe in a loving God when there's so much darkness and injustice around us?
That's a question that has challenged theologians and philosophers for millennia. And I don't think there are easy answers, but I do believe that faith is not about denying the reality of suffering. It's about finding meaning and purpose in the midst of it.
So it's about holding on to hope even when things feel hopeless.
Exactly. It's about trusting that even in the darkest of times, there's a light shining within us, a spark of the divine that can never be extinguished.
But what if that spark feels like it's flickering? What if we're struggling to keep the flame of faith alive?
That's when we need to lean into the practices that nourish our souls. Prayer, meditation, connection with others who share our faith. It's like tending a garden. We need to water the seeds of faith, nurture them with love and attention, and trust that they will eventually blossom.
It's about creating a fertile ground for faith to flourish, isn't it? But what about those times when it feels like we're praying into a void, when our words seem to vanish into thin air?
Even then, our prayers are not in vain. They're like seeds planted in the ground. We may not see immediate results, but they're taking root, growing unseen, and in time they will bear fruit.
It's about trusting in the unseen and the power of prayer to transform not just our circumstances, but ourselves.
And that transformation might not happen overnight. It might be a slow, gradual process like the erosion of a rock by water. But over time, those persistent prayers can shape our hearts, our minds, and our souls.
It's like we're being sculpted by the divine slowly but surely into the people we were meant to be.
And that sculpting process can be uncomfortable, even painful at times. But it's ultimately leading us towards greater wholeness, towards a deeper alignment with our true selves.
So even in the silence, even in the struggle, God is at work within us.
Absolutely. He's shaping us, refining us, and preparing us for a purpose that's beyond our current understanding.
But what about those times when we feel like we're being punished for our past mistakes? When the silence feels like a sign of God's disapproval?
That sense of guilt and shame can be incredibly debilitating. It can keep us trapped in a cycle of self-recrimination, preventing us from experiencing the fullness of God's love and forgiveness.
It's like we're carrying a heavy burden, a weight that's dragging us down, keeping us from moving forward.
And that burden is often rooted in a distorted view of God, a belief that He's a harsh judge waiting to punish us for our transgressions.
But that's not the God that I know. The God that I've come to understand through my own journey of faith is a God of compassion, a God of mercy, a God who wants nothing more than for us to experience His boundless love and forgiveness.
And that forgiveness is available to us no matter what we've done, no matter how far we've strayed.
But how do we access that forgiveness when we're drowning in guilt and shame? When the silence feels like a wall separating us from God's love?
It starts with acknowledging those feelings, with bringing them into the light of awareness. We need to name them, to feel them fully, and to offer them to God in prayer.
So instead of trying to suppress those feelings, we need to embrace them to allow them to move through us.
Exactly. It's like allowing a wound to breathe so that it can heal properly. When we try to hide our pain, to bury it deep inside, it festers and grows, poisoning our hearts and minds.
But when we bring it into the light, when we offer it to God in prayer, we allow His healing love to flow into those wounded places.
And that healing love is transformative. It can break the chains of guilt and shame, setting us free to experience the fullness of God's grace.
But what if we've hurt others? What if our past mistakes have caused pain and suffering to those around us? How can we reconcile that with the idea of God's forgiveness?
Forgiveness is not about condoning harmful actions. It's about releasing ourselves from the grip of resentment and bitterness so that we can move forward with our lives. And it's also about seeking reconciliation with those we've harmed, where possible, making amends for our past mistakes.
So it's about taking responsibility for our actions, making things right, and allowing ourselves to be transformed by the process.
Exactly. It's about embracing the fullness of our humanity, both the light and the shadow, and allowing God's love to work through us, to heal us, and to guide us towards a path of wholeness and reconciliation.
It's a journey, isn't it? A process of continual growth and transformation.
It is indeed. And the beauty of it is that we're never alone in this journey. We have God's love to guide us, the support of others who share our faith, and the wisdom of those who have walked this path before us.
But what about those times when we feel like we're walking through a desert parched for a drop of God's presence? When the silence feels like a barren wasteland devoid of life and hope?
Those desert experiences can be incredibly challenging. They test our faith, our resilience, and our very sense of self, but they can also be transformative.
How so?
Think of the Israelites wandering in the wilderness for 40 years. It was a time of hardship, of testing, but it was also a time of purification, a time of stripping away all that was superfluous, all that was hindering their relationship with God.
So it's like a refining fire burning away the impurities to reveal the gold beneath.
Precisely. And those desert experiences can have the same effect on us. They can strip away our illusions, our attachments, our false sense of security, forcing us to confront our deepest fears and to discover a strength and resilience we didn't know we possessed.
It's like we're being forced to rely on something deeper than ourselves, something beyond our own limited resources.
Exactly. And in that surrender, in that letting go, we open ourselves up to a new level of trust and intimacy with God.
It's like we're learning to walk by faith, not by sight.
And that kind of faith is incredibly powerful. It can sustain us through the darkest of times. It can give us hope when all seems lost. And it can lead us to a deeper understanding of God's love and faithfulness.
But what if we're struggling to muster that kind of faith? What if the silence feels deafening the doubt, overwhelming the darkness all-consuming?
Even then, we're not beyond the reach of God's grace. There are practices we can engage in to nurture our souls, to strengthen our faith, and to find solace in the midst of struggle.
Like what?
One practice that's incredibly powerful is simply spending time in nature. There's something about being surrounded by the beauty and majesty of creation that can calm our minds, soothe our souls, and reconnect us to the divine presence.
It's like we're stepping into a cathedral, a sacred space where we can feel the pulse of life, the rhythm of the universe, the interconnectedness of all things.
Exactly. And that connection to something larger than ourselves can give us a sense of perspective, a reminder that our struggles are not the whole story.
It's like we're being held by something greater than ourselves, something that's both loving and wise, something that's working for our good, even when we can't see it.
And that something is always available to us, whether we feel it or not. It's the ground of our being, the source of our life, the love that sustains us through every season.
But what if we're struggling to access that love? What if we feel like we've built walls around our hearts, barriers that are preventing us from experiencing the fullness of God's grace?
Those walls are often built out of fear, pain, and past trauma. They're a way of protecting ourselves from further hurt and disappointment.
But they can also keep us imprisoned, can't they? Trapped in a cycle of isolation and self-protection.
Exactly. And the key to breaking free from that prison is to cultivate self-compassion, to learn to treat ourselves with the same kindness and understanding that we would offer to a loved one.
So it's about being gentle with ourselves, acknowledging our pain and allowing ourselves to be loved, flaws and all.
Precisely. And as we cultivate that self-compassion, as we learn to accept ourselves unconditionally, we also open ourselves up to experiencing the unconditional love of God.
It's like we're creating space for grace to flow into our lives.
Exactly. And that grace is transformative. It can heal our wounds, soften our hearts, and break down the walls that have been keeping us separated from God's love. But what if we're struggling to access that love? What if we feel like we've built walls around our hearts? Barriers that are preventing us from experiencing the fullness of God's grace.
Right.
Those walls are often built out of fear, pain, and past trauma. They're a way of protecting ourselves from further hurt and disappointment.
But they can also keep us in prison, can't they?
Yep.
Trapped in a cycle of isolation and self-protection.
Exactly. And the key to breaking free from that prison is to practice surrender, to let go of our need to control, to understand, to figure everything out. It's about trusting that even when we can't see the path, even when we feel lost and alone, God is still with us, guiding us, supporting us, loving us unconditionally.
That's a beautiful thought. But it's not always easy to put into practice, is it? Especially when we're facing real challenges, real pain, real suffering.
No, it's not always easy. But it's in those difficult moments, those times when we feel like giving up, that faith becomes most essential. It's the anchor that keeps us grounded, the light that guides us through the darkness, the love that sustains us when all else fails.
But what if our faith feels weak? What if we're struggling to believe? What if the silence feels like a deafening roar, drowning out any sense of hope or possibility?
That's when we need to lean into the practices that nourish our souls, that strengthen our connection to the divine. Practices like prayer meditation, spending time in nature, connecting with others who share our faith.
Right.
It's like we're building a fire gathering, kindling, feeding the flames with intention and devotion.
Yeah, I like that.
And those practices, those rituals, those acts of faith can help to rekindle the flame of hope, to illuminate the path ahead, and to remind us that we're never truly alone in this journey.
But what if we've tried all those things and we still feel lost? What if this silence feels like an impenetrable wall, separating us from God's love, from our true purpose, from the joy that we long to experience?
Even then there is hope. Even in the darkest of nights, the stars are still shining. Even in the deepest silence, God's love is still present. It may not always feel like it, but it's true.
So how do we access that love? How do we break through that wall of silence and experience the fullness of God's grace?
It starts with a willingness to let go, to surrender our fears, our doubts, our need to control, to trust that even when we can't see it, even when we can't feel it, God is still working in our lives, orchestrating events, guiding our steps, leading us towards our highest good.
It's about releasing the oars and allowing ourselves to be carried by the current, trusting that it will eventually lead us to our destination.
Exactly. And that destination may not be what we expected. It may not be what we planned for, but it will always be what's best for us, what's most aligned with our soul's purpose.
But what if we're afraid to let go? What if we're clinging to the familiar, even if it's no longer serving us?
That fear is understandable. Change can be scary, but it's also an opportunity for growth, for expansion, for a deeper experience of life.
So it's about embracing the unknown, trusting the process, and allowing ourselves to be surprised by the beauty of what emerges.
Precisely. And that beauty may not always be obvious at first. It may be hidden beneath the surface, waiting to be discovered like a pearl in an oyster.
So it's about having the courage to dive deep, to explore the depths of our own being, and to trust that the treasure we're seeking is already within us.
Exactly. And that treasure, that pearl of great price, is the love that resides at the heart of our being. It's the love that connects us to God, to each other, and to all of creation.
It's the love that heals, that transforms, that empowers, and that sets us free.
And that love is always available to us no matter what. No matter how lost we feel, no matter how dark the night, no matter how deafening the silence.
So even when we can't see it, even when we can't feel it, God's love is still there, shining like a beacon, guiding us home.
It is indeed. And that homecoming, that reunion with the divine, is the greatest joy we can experience in this lifetime.
Thank you so much for sharing your wisdom and insights with us today. It's been an incredibly enlightening conversation.
The pleasure has been all mine. And thank you to all our listeners for joining us on this journey of exploration. May you find peace, hope, and love in the midst of the silence.